All right, folks. Well, here we are on Healthcare Unfiltered. I am really very honored, happy, delighted to host my current guest, Kate Dilligan. It took us a while to schedule this episode, but it is worth the wait because I've been really looking very much forward to talking to you, Kate, especially after I read even more about your accomplishments and I'm going to make sure my readers and viewers and listeners are aware of the Forbes article that talked about you, which came out in December 2022. But I'm not going to do a lot of spoiler alerts. I'm going to have you start telling us a little bit about you, who you are, and really how. Just let's start about who you are.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's a real pleasure to have an opportunity to have a conversation with you today. So, a little bit about me. I've had a couple of different careers. My first career was politics. Then I went to Stanford Business School. And after that, I got working in tech. And when I was working in tech, I actually wound up leading a business unit that was doing software systems for the intelligence community. So I was working in tech, but I was also, it was sort of a hybrid tech and government position. And I was really proud of the work that I was leading at the time because we did make a difference in national security. And then it's the oldest story in the world. I got sick. And so in October of 2016, I was diagnosed with stage 2B breast cancer. And I was 42, 43. I was just turning 43. Um, and I have had no family history of breast cancer. It came completely out of left field. I do not have the BRCA gene. And all of a sudden, I was thrust into this world of being a cancer patient. And, I'm well educated. I, had a really interesting career. But all of a sudden, I just felt lost and overwhelmed and terrified. And so the reason why I founded Cooler Heads is because I've had that experience of sitting in the medical oncologist's office and being told just how serious my cancer was. Because obviously, by the time you get to the med onc, you know you have cancer. But it's that first meeting where you're told roughly, what the imaging says, what their initial treatment plan is going to be, and hearing chemotherapy, surgery, radiation, long-term hormone treatment. And I had no idea how to cope with any of that. And so what we do at Cooler Heads is we build the evidence-based products, content, and services that cancer patients and survivors need to manage those daunting side effects of treatment. We want to make the process of being a cancer patient easier. And we've started by addressing the side effect that the sickest patients fear most, that I certainly had a lot of terror about, which is hair loss from chemotherapy. So I would imagine that anybody listening to this has had the experience of somebody they really care about calling them and saying, "Hey, I want to talk to you about something, but I'm not ready to tell everybody else. So I want to talk to you about this. I'm not ready for the world to know." And here's the thing, whether you're a man or a woman, when all your hair falls out because you're going through chemotherapy, guess what? Everybody knows. And then all of a sudden, you as that patient, you're all of a sudden answering questions about your diagnosis. You are, dealing with people making all kinds of crazy recommendations. I'm sure, as an oncologist, you've heard all kinds of crazy things that your patients have had recommended to them. And, one of the things that was the hardest for me was comforting other people who were upset about the fact that I was sick. And so think about that. Like, you're the cancer patient, you're coping with the fact that you have this really serious diagnosis. And then all of a sudden, everybody else is freaking out and you have to be the person comforting them and telling them that it'll be okay. Like that's not good. It's not good for anybody's emotional health. And, this data is only for breast cancer patients because they don't ask this question of all their patients. But, 1 in 12 breast cancer patients refuse chemo because they don't want to lose their hair. They don't want to be put through that stigma. They don't want to deal with the questions in the comments. They don't want to deal with a wig. And so, I talk about, building this product and scalp cooling and what we do, it's not a beauty thing. It's not about women. It's about privacy. It's about agency, and it's about identity. It's about controlling the narrative on who knows that you're sick. It's giving patients some control back when their life feels completely out of control. And if you're getting the kind of chemo that makes your hair fall out, your life is kind of out of control because now your life is all about your diagnosis. And you're in a unique position, particularly to understand that as an oncologist. But lastly, it's also about identity. It's about allowing the patient to look in the mirror when they're brushing their teeth and see somebody that they recognize. And that's why I'm really proud of the work that we're doing.
Yeah, this is amazing. I agree with you. I think that the assumption that sometimes oncologists have, or physicians in general have, about what bothers and does not bother patients is just simply assumptions. Because I have had scenarios, to your earlier point, with much older patients that have declined chemotherapy despite knowing that the chemotherapy is beneficial because exactly of hair loss. And we must respect these wishes, and we must, obviously, patient has the autonomy to make these decisions, but we cannot assume that hair loss, it's hair loss. I also liked what you said, it's not just about women, because I have had many men patients who really were terrified about losing their hair. Some of them were very dismissive of it, and they're like, oh, it's great, blah, blah, blah. But and I know that doesn't really apply to everybody. Kate, so I want to go back just to your story as a patient first, to the extent that you want to share with us, obviously. But you were diagnosed with breast cancer. And despite the fact that there's so much internet information, right? You just Google and do all of that stuff. All of this plethora of information does not always lead to less uncertainty. It actually sometimes could lead to more confusion.
Absolutely. I refer to it as Dr. Facebook, Dr. Google, and Dr. Amazon, which are not reliable sources of information because they certainly didn't go to medical school and they don't know what the heck they're talking about. And you couldn't be more right, because that actually is the crux of my story. So, the therapy that lets patients keep their hair, it's called either cold cap therapy if you do it with dry ice systems, or scalp cooling if it's with a mechanized system. I had never heard of it. And when I was diagnosed, I brought one of my closest friends with me to my first oncology appointments. And, I recommend anybody, if you get diagnosed and there's a lawyer in your life, bring them to your oncology appointments because they'll ask really good follow-up questions and take very detailed notes. Like, highly recommend. But Sarah actually went down the Google rabbit hole, and because she was looking at side effect management, because I was so overwhelmed. I was so stressed out. I was not going to look. I was like, this is not helpful. This is only going to make me more upset and more anxious. So I'm not looking. Like, it's not that. And it wasn't that I was in denial. I was like, I'm going to get information about my diagnosis from my medical team, and I'm going to not go elsewhere. So when Sarah told me that there might be a way that I could keep my hair, and we asked my nurse navigator about it, she was like, oh yeah, we've had people do it and we've had it work really well, but most people have to pay at least $6,000, so we don't talk about it. And I can get more into the story of what my experience was. I wound up spending $8,000 on dry ice systems and paying people to administer them for me and this whole thing. So I was able to keep my hair, but at the time I was making a lot of money, and I was able to throw a lot of money at the problem, is the way I refer to it. But I would have patients come up to me almost every time I was getting chemo and ask me what I was doing. Or, one person I really remember, I did chemo every other Thursday. For those of you who know a lot about oncology, I did 4 cycles of AC and 4 of Taxol. So every other week. And so you'd see the same people who were on, the same treatment schedule that you, or, if they were there every Thursday or every other Thursday when I was there. And this woman in the elevator said, I hope you don't mind my asking, but how do you still have your hair? And I said, well, I'm doing cold cap therapy, but it's really expensive and it's been really high friction, and just told her a little bit about it. And she teared up and she said, wow, I really wish someone had told me.
Wow. So it wasn't the cost issue, it was the knowledge issue.
Yeah.
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 And
And I didn't have the knowledge, right? And so like exactly to your point, like there's so much information out there. A lot of the information is bad. And especially when you're dealing with something serious like a cancer diagnosis, I chose to get my information directly from my medical team. That's how I chose to deal with it. And so it's not like I was avoiding anything, but I was like, and you know, and one of the things that my med onc told me, he's like, I'm okay with you looking up information if it's from a .org or a .gov, website. He's like, anything else, stay away from, please.
yeah, yeah. But look, I mean, I think, and frankly, you're extremely well educated. You have you've worked in various industries. And if anyone could separate the signal from the noise, it would be you. I mean, it would be you'd say, it doesn't make sense. This makes sense. So
Yeah,
imagine people who are way less educated, and
exactly.
they will be extremely confused. I mean,
Exactly.
yeah. So you went on this journey of ACNT, and as you were going through this, that's when you decide to go and do the cold therapy.
Yes, yes.
Tell us
So
about this. What does that like? What is that therapy like? What actually happens? Like, what did you actually do?
yeah, so the way that I experienced, and I use cold cap therapy, even though now I have a scalp cooling company, and I'll explain the difference. So for people who aren't familiar with it, what this therapy does and the way patients get to keep their hair, and I always feel embarrassed when I'm explaining this in front of doctors, because so please, jump in if you
I'm
feel
not
that.
jumping. I'm not jumping. You're educating us.
So fundamentally what it is it's medically induced hypothermia. You bring the patient's scalp temperature down to 65 degrees before, during, and for a minimum of 2 hours following each chemotherapy infusion, because fundamentally what you're doing is you're shutting down the hair follicle. So the blood that goes to the hair follicles is not reaching the hair follicles because the hair follicles are shut down for when the drug is at its strongest in the body. And so by preventing the absorption of as much chemotherapy, patients get to maintain the majority of their hair. And so, in this therapy,
And how do they bring the temperature down? Like, do you get into a room, into like how do you do that?
so the way I experienced it is with gel caps that are sewn into a crude sort of cap, and they're cooled in dry ice. So for every single chemotherapy infusion, I had somebody come who was trained, that had a full-on ice chest with 50 pounds of dry ice and 4 different cap systems in them. Because, anybody who's listening to this has had the experience of, those gel packs that you put in the freezer. Well, they're soft when they're warm, but once they're cold, they're rigid. And so again, you're trying to get even cooling over the patient's head. So you're taking this rigid object and you're trying to figure out, how do you Velcro it around the patient's head over their hairline so they're not going to wind up with patchy bald spots, which is, just as disfiguring as losing your hair. And these gel packs, very similar to ice that you put on your ankle when you've jammed it, they stop being efficacious after 20, 30 minutes. So you're switching these things on and off every 20 to 30 minutes for sometimes up to 6, 7 hours. So that's why, I had to pay somebody to come and administer it for me. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while, and problems that come up with that. But you have to do it with every single chemotherapy infusion, because with chemo, as many people listening to this will know, your hair really starts to fall out around day 21 after chemo. And so if you miss one chemotherapy cycle, that you don't do scalp cooling, like, you're pretty
But
much
but part but part of the process is you do the scalp cooling during chemotherapy, you said.
yes. So you start administering it during pre-meds.
So you're
So
okay, your pre-meds in the office, and then you keep it on during chemotherapy.
and then for 2 hours after.
But the 2 hours after, you could do it at home, like you could leave, right? Or no, you have to stay in the office.
Well, so because the people who were doing my cold caps didn't want to go to my house, I either sometimes got to sit in the chair, or there was the night before Thanksgiving in 2016, we were in the lobby of the infusion center until 9:30 at night. That was super fun. And the mechanized systems that, were cleared by the FDA, started being cleared by the FDA in 2015, 2016, they are large machines that, are attached to caps that are, providing constant cooling to the patient. So the patient doesn't have to have somebody switching these things on and off their head, but they're tethered to this large machine. So if you're an oncology line manager, you basically have cut the throughput of that chair in half for the day. And so if you're a small institution where, if you're, let's say a 10 or a 15 chair infusion center, you need each of those chairs. And all of a sudden you can't give up two or three of them to see fewer patients a day, because it not only costs you a lot of money, but you build an infusion center for the size of, your patient population.
Sure.
And so essentially, one of the reasons why this therapy for so long has been the orphan stepchild of oncology is because it's been either it's always been very expensive. With the dry eye systems like what I used, it's been really hard to do and really labor intensive. Or with, the systems that are mechanized, they're really only available at, major oncology centers like UCSF and Memorial Sloan Kettering, because, they're global institutions and they've got the bandwidth to do it. And so they're going to offer everything.
Right.
And so community oncology practices, private oncology practices have just been like, no, we can't do it. And that's one of the things that I'm very proud of that we've done is, 85% of our accounts are greenfield and that they've never offered scalp cooling before. Because they're now saying, because our system is small and portable, it's designed for patients to self-administer it. And also when they're done with treatment, to your point, they get up out of the chair and they can complete cooling in the waiting room, in the atrium, in the cafe, someplace else. So we're not changing patient workflows. So all of a sudden, this is something that practices are now able to offer and are really expanding in offering to their patients.
And the treatment is just the day of the chemotherapy. The next day, you don't need to do anything. The day before, nothing to do. And Kate, in general, for obviously folks who are doing this, obviously you have to have access to it in the practices you're going to. But what is the chances of success? In other words, 100% if you do this, you're not going to have hair loss, or 90% successful and there are 10% of people still lose hair, or there's like, what if you want to tell somebody who's asking you, how would you say the upper chances of the treatment being successful?
So there's we measure success in, did a patient view that they kept at least half their hair? Because if you've kept about half your hair, you can go out to dinner, can go to the grocery store, can go to your kid's soccer game, and your hair is thinner, but the rest of the world doesn't know. And we actually tell patients, because it really is based on your chemo regimen. If you're doing weekly Taxol, we see excellent results in the vast majority of our patients. If you're doing, the AC and Taxol.
No, I mean, yours ACT is very,
Yeah, it's gnarly. Yeah. My first day of AC, the nurse looked at me and she's like, "Oh, you're getting the red devil." And I was like, "Not helpful. Not helpful." That was not a helpful comment. Thank you.
That is not the way you want to start. So obviously the results vary, but keeping more than 50% is successful. Do you think this for folks who follow this regimen, 100% of them keep more than 50% of their hair?
We've seen like over 85% keep
That's
over
great.
50% of their hair. And here's the thing, like we also do, and we're continuing to innovate and figure out better and better ways to do it, because while you don't have to do, like, it's not like you need the machine and you're doing extra scalp cooling in between chemo sessions. We coach patients on how to care for their hair to get the best results. So you don't want to be taking a hot shower or, swimming in really chlorinated water or going into the sauna. Like, you don't want to do things that's going to really exacerbate blood flow to your hair follicles. So you want to wash your hair very gently with cool water, only wash it twice a week. We do a lot of coaching around that. And so when we've seen a lot of hair loss, and I'm not blaming the patient sometimes have said is like, "I really didn't follow your instructions." And so like we're working and figuring out like what are the best ways for us to communicate with our users. But one thing I do want to stress, and so, and there are some chemotherapy regimens where we tell patients, like, you're going to lose the majority of your hair. Like, we would consider, successful with this chemo regimen, you're probably going to keep, 35, 40% of your hair. But here's the thing with those patients, they elect to do scalp cooling because, again, you're protecting the hair follicles. And so even in those instances, patients are seeing regrowth during chemo. So there's the added benefit of having your hair grow back faster. Because, like, I don't know if you're aware, but there's a lot of lawsuits, especially around Taxotere, about permanent hair loss. And that really hasn't been communicated clearly to patients, so they know. But if you're able to preserve your hair follicles, you're avoiding that. And so patients are talking about, like, within 2-3 months, they feel like their hair is really getting back to normal. And so it's also, decreasing, what can be, a 1.5-year process of your hair growing back.
Yeah, that is amazing. So when you're getting the chemotherapy and you're going the Red Devil, that you were receiving the additional therapies, probably you were not thinking about forming a company. I mean, you were just getting, when I get the chemotherapy, I'm going to hopefully have great results and I'm going to move on.
Yeah.
At what point in your journey, you just had the, what, maybe I should form a company and take this a little bit broader. Did something happen? Was it, obviously your experience triggered you to think about it, but I'll speak for you that you were probably just focusing on the chemotherapy and the cancer.
Absolutely.
At some point.
I was like, I want to get through this.
Yes. So when did this change to become, this idea became something, let me pursue this?
So there's two parts of that story. So the first part is the day before my third chemo infusion. I get a phone call from the representative of the company telling me that the person I was paying $500 a session to come. So I live in San Diego. And the person who was my cold cap coach had gone on vacation. She had a substitute that was covering for her while she was gone. The substitute quit the day before I had chemo. And so the company called me and was like, we don't have anybody. And that meant that all my hair was going to fall out. And I was just out of luck. And even though I'd already spent a couple $1,000s and was really invested in this, sorry, we can't help you. And I told this person unequivocally that was not acceptable. And I was like, here's what we're going to do. You're going to call me back in 2 hours with the name of somebody who will come down to San Diego. I will put them up in a hotel because I had chemo like at 8 a.m. the next morning. I will put them up in a hotel and I will pay them $1,000 to do this. So I will double their fee to do this for me. And this is a person who literally was going to come with the big dry ice chest and all the caps and all the other accessories to do it and would be there with me for hours, just switching these things on and off my head. And that was like the first time where I was like, this is really broken. I was like, this is absolute garbage. This is completely broken. And I actually wound up having to do that twice. So, I was talking earlier about how my nurse navigator said most people spend $6,000 and how I spent $8,000. It was bribing people from LA to come down and help me because I'm in San Diego. But, and I was kind of railing at friends and telling them the story and was like, somebody should do something about this. And, but I got through treatment, they cut it out. It was surgery, great outcome, did 6 weeks of radiation. I was, through treatment. And I decided to leave the company that I'd been at for a while because things had just gotten really political and toxic while I'd been sick. And prior to my diagnosis, I'd lost both of my parents in the previous 3 years. So I'd really just had a really bad 4 years. And I was like, okay, it's time to reassess what I'm doing with my life. And I was talking with some friends. So, I negotiated a settlement and I just took some time off. I traveled. I thought about what I wanted to do. I was very fortunate that I was privileged enough to have the capacity to do that. And in talking with friends about this, about, my experience with cold cap therapy and just like how broken it was, I was talking to 2 of my really close friends from business school. And I was like, I've thought about, just doing this and building something better. And they were like, well, you should. And I was like, really? Because, I told you, like my first career was politics. I went to business school. I was working in software systems for the United States government. I was not in healthcare. I had never built, a piece of, electrical equipment, let alone something that was going to be regulated by the FDA. But, one of the real gifts of, some amazing people that I have in my life is their encouragement and being like, well, if not you, then who? Because I had this idea, like, why is this so expensive? Why can't this be profitable for infusion centers? Why can't this be portable? Why can't this be, real standard of care stuff? So, we should make it so that, even though this isn't just for breast cancer patients, but, the Komen Foundation shouldn't be able to use pictures of bald ladies wearing lipstick and earrings to raise money every October. Like, this doesn't have to be the norm. We don't have to accept that. And so I was like, yeah, I think I will. And, one of the another gift of being an alum of a place like Stanford is there's not just the network of people you have, but like there's this huge community of people that, I started reaching out to and be like, who's done med devices that I know, or who knows people who have done med devices, and really just started asking a lot of questions. And so for the first, 6 to 9 months, it was really just doing customer inquiry and really understanding. Before I started taking outside money, I was investing my own money to be like, is even what I want to build technically feasible? Like, is there technology that we can do it and not have it be $1 zillion so we can make this affordable? So really, like the first, part of the company was really identifying what the requirements would be for the product that's now AMA, that's now commercially available, that's helping patients in states across the country, which is awesome. But it was really just figuring out, can I build it? Can we make the economics work? And then once I was really convinced of that, I was like, well, let's go.
So this is very exciting. It triggered a couple of questions that I was listening to you. One is essentially you were going to build a competing company with the company that was giving you the therapy, but that the process, I guess, the technology is the same. So, which
the
is
therapy is the same.
the
It's
therapy is
hypothermia, regardless of
so
who
the
it is.
therapy is the same. So when you think about your business, when your business brain is thinking, because you can't change the therapy is the same. Were you thinking, how can I reduce cost to make it economically feasible? Like, were you thinking about the COGS type of thing, and what do I do, and how do I scale it? Because you're not going to change the technology. So what you have control over, A, how do I scale it? And B, how do I reduce the cost?
Yeah. So almost exactly that. And so there were two things that I really dug into, or what are the pain points of patients? Like if a patient is told about this, why don't they do it? It's because it's too hard to do, like the dry ice and all of that stuff, and it's too expensive. And so that's why people don't do it. And then the next part was, why don't doctors recommend it? Why don't doctors talk about it? And again, it's cost and it's variable results especially with the dry ice systems. But then it's chair throughput. And so, like on average, we just sort of use as a benchmark, each chemotherapy patient makes about 16 grand for the infusion center. And so again, every time you do scalp cooling, that is $16,000 less that infusion center is going to make that day. And so I was like, how do we shift that so we're not changing those patient workflows and actually developing a business model where we're making money for the infusion center, because now Medicare is reimbursing for scalp cooling. And so the way that we've structured it, we make it profitable for infusion centers to offer this. So, it's not going to build them. This is, Ryan, our chief commercial officer, his line is, they're not going to build a new wing of the hospital, but it's going to start covering FTEs, which is a big deal. And it's also what we're seeing is we're having pockets pop up of, one healthcare system gets it, so then another one wants it, because it's a very powerful tool in attracting patients. Because I'm sure you've seen this, multiple times in your practice, and you Chicago, like very, high profile, very prominent medical institutions, but if you're a community hospital, especially, private practice, how do you attract that patient to come to you? Because healthcare in America is fundamentally a business. And a cancer patient that's going through chemo, they're going to have other kinds of treatment too, not always surgery. But they're probably going to do surgery or radiation or they're going to do something else, not just chemo. And so that patient is probably worth about $250,000 in profit. So you want that patient to come to you. And so how can we create this where it really becomes a powerful marketing tool for these infusion centers and a way for them to capture patients? And we're actually starting to work with our accounts on being very public and, doing AdWords and like helping education and helping to push patients to some of our accounts where, back to my story, I'd never was told that this was a thing. And so really having, we're working on, getting the story out there, really being evangelists for this therapy, but then also like jumping up and down with pom-poms and flashing lights saying, hey, and it's now available to you in Columbus, Ohio. It's available to you in Cincinnati. It's available to you in Flagstaff. Like it's available to you in Marietta, Georgia, like in these places that previously didn't have access to the treatment, which for us is really exciting.
When you think about it, an oncologist's office and the nurses are going to offer patients medications to minimize or mitigate nausea or vomiting or some of these other side effects.
Yeah.
But to your point, you're absolutely correct. Hair loss, we talk about it, but we say, well, you're going to lose your hair. You can wear a scarf or something like that.
Yeah, no, it's going to happen QED.
Yeah,
sorry.
Yeah. So I think it's, and we don't say that about nausea, vomiting. We say, what, we are going to actually do this about it. So okay, you thought about the idea. You put on your business hat, you worked on an economic model of possibly how you're going to scale, what's the cost, how do I reduce the cost?
Yep.
And then you put obviously your own money and time and effort into this. And then did you have to go and get investor money? How tough was that? Tell me. I'm always curious about that part. How do you pitch? How do you go? Or, of course, in California, it's probably easier because it's closer to where a lot of biotech industry. But how tough was it to raise money?
Very hard, because California, is, the cradle of venture capital. But here's the thing. Women founders raise about 4% of all venture capital. And so I was a solo female founder who had never started a company before, who was not an engineer, and who had never worked in healthcare. And the legacy systems, and, I was talking earlier about how—
But you have a compelling story.
I have a great story.
You have a compelling story. And I think your story, you're the patient and you're the founder. I'm going to tell you, listening to you for the first time, but no, this is true. It's a compelling story. And I think that story by itself, in my opinion, sells.
I've had to get better at telling it though. And so like when I first started to raise money, like I was pissed that like there weren't better options for patients. And it was still really raw because I started this company in 2018. And, I was starting this company when I was still doing, oral chemo. So I did Xeloda for 8 cycles because I had HER2 positive breast cancer. And I told my doctors I wanted to be as aggressive as possible. And so when I was done with everything and I was starting tamoxifen, they're like, well, you should also do Xeloda so, when people talk about not all chemo makes your hair fall out, I've gotten to do both kinds because I'm just lucky that way. So, like I was still doing Xeloda when I was, filing, the articles of incorporation. And, venture wants to back a sure thing. And so a patient story, though, that's never built hardware was not compelling. And I have some phenomenal, though, investors. Being part of the Ad Astra community in San Diego got me Crystal McKellar and Lucy Postins, who were my first 2 board members, who were early investors. And, Crystal, phenomenally successful venture capitalist. Lucy, just like mind-blowingly successful entrepreneur. And so I found my way into working predominantly early on with some phenomenal women who understand the complexity of these odds and helped us get to the point where we are now, where we've raised more than $9 million. We've gotten millions of dollars in non-dilutive funding from the National Cancer Institute. We're going to wind up raising more money. Allison Long-Patine and Maria Gonzalez Blanche, key investors in the company now who are just, visionaries and are helping us change this. But as an entrepreneur, and another reason why venture doesn't want to go in with solo founders early is because they know that you get told no all the time. And so can you withstand that? Can you, our last round, I probably did 140 meetings, 140 pitches, and 30 of them invested, like some number like that, or move forward in the process. Like, you have to get very comfortable being uncomfortable. You have to be okay with being told no. And especially in the early days, they're like, she's going to give up and quit. Like, we don't think.
But you got me very curious, Kate. You said you got better in telling the story.
Yes.
Can you maybe elaborate a little bit as, one of your earliest opportunities where you probably talked about your company and what you're trying to do, and you were rejected, and how did you pivot, and like, what did you actually do to tell the story in a more compelling way to a VC?
So one of the best things that I did, and a piece of advice I now give to any entrepreneur who's, just getting started and thinking about doing it, is getting involved in your local ecosystem. And so I was part of an accelerator here in San Diego called Ad Astra, and it was a 3-month program with only 3 entrepreneurs, and 3 of the people working at the accelerator, we each got our own champion. And one of the things that they worked with us on is pitching. And it wasn't just pitching, it was also like mock investor meetings where they would bring in people throughout, the startup community in San Diego. And so you go into a room and they get to ask you a bunch of questions, and you get better at answering the questions, and you get asked a bunch of questions that you don't know the answer to. And so you're like, oh, you're like,
it's unfiltered, buddy. You can say whatever you want.
It's unfiltered, and it's low, it's no stakes essentially, because the people, and I mean, actually, I think all 3 of us wound up getting investors, but like the purpose of those meetings was basically to train us. And so it's repetition and understanding, and then being able to ask people like what worked and what didn't work. And even, this goes back to my political days where, as a political fundraiser and strategist, you also have to be very, comfortable asking people for money and having people tell you no. But then you also have to know, like, why would this person, either, contribute to a campaign, or why would this person invest in the company? And so really help me hone who I was talking to. Is their fund at the right stage for the right amount of money that we need? Like, is it a good fit? Do they invest in things like this? So we could really get closer to this pattern matching that investors have, because they want to. So it was just a lot of practice. It was a lot of practice. And, one thing I'm very proud of is I have investors that are very engaged, part of our strategy sessions now, who wouldn't invest early on, but I built relationships with them and I stayed in touch. And,
perseverance.
Somebody knows your face, fine. But you have to be professional, and it actually oftentimes provides an opportunity to have a conversation. Well, why? Like, what is it you would want to see? Like, what are our key milestones that we need to be hitting for the next round? Like, what is it that you want to see? And so being able to go back to them and be like, hey, I listened to you. And guess what? Those things that you asked me about, well, this is done. This actually we deprioritized, and this is how we're handling it. And this other thing is, 75% of the way there. And then they're like, huh. So she keeps moving the company forward, and she listens.
And you're a doer. You're able to do
and
this.
I'm a doer. And so they're like,
so you got the money, you have the company, and obviously the core, I guess the core product or the core product of the company is the hair issue.
Yeah, it's Ama.
Were you looking at expanding this further in terms of, because you talked in the beginning about how do I disseminate to patients information pertaining to side effects and everything beyond the hair loss issue? Is there an actual educational arm of the company, and how do you go around reaching patients? Because frankly, I view you as a leader, an entrepreneur, but there's an element of what you're doing that's completely aligned with patient advocacy.
Yes.
This is what patient advocates do. Whether you are a patient or not, you're able to find ways to educate and help patients. And you were a patient and you're an advocate now. So how is this educational component of your company working?
Yeah, and that's really like the next stage of our growth. So one of the, with startups, you need to get lucky. And I was fortunate enough to be able to bring on board a woman named Julia DiVincenzo, who actually was my nurse navigator when I was sick. And she's amazing because I was her patient. And we built this great relationship all throughout treatment. And I told her, I was like, hey, because she would come to me, either when I was during treatment or then, after treatment, even before I'd started the company, and being like, hey, if patients have questions about cold caps, would you tell them? And I told Julia, I was like, hey, you just give them my phone number. You don't have to ask me for permission. Just give out my phone number and my email address. Happy to talk to anybody about this. And so Julia and I stayed in touch. And then I started building this company. And then I got to the point where I would need somebody on board to really anchor that. And so now what we're moving into is, we have the medical device, and now we're looking at what does that digital platform look like? So how can we, have an app where it's not only, content around scalp cooling, but like we can do chemo training, we can do other educational modules, like suggested topics of conversation with your medical team, like spoon feeding patients exactly where they are, because we have this product that's really sticky that patients want to engage with. And then we're going to expand that into patient reported outcomes, which, people in healthcare know, or, how are you getting information in real time from patients outside of the hospital setting? Because like one of the things, my next big mountain that I want to climb is getting patient report outcomes, or PROs, to the point where, we can then put a learning layer on it and starting to flag to our accounts. Because again, we sell our systems to the hospitals because they bill insurance and Medicare for it. But then if we can start getting them patient data and start flagging for them, hey, this patient is meeting the profile of somebody whose, white blood cells aren't bounced back enough, that they're probably going to have to reschedule them for chemo. Like that's a huge pain point in oncology still. You have to come in and do labs for each chemotherapy infusion. A fair number of patients aren't well enough to do it. Their white blood cell count hasn't bounced back. Like what are tools that we can put in place to start flagging those patients and be like, it's 2 days before, maybe you want to bring this patient in proactively before their point, before their scheduled chemo, and push it out, like what are the additional things that we can do? So that's our next hill to climb. And then longer term is using those patient reported outcomes and having a full complement of, consumer packaged good products. So not everything regulated by the FDA, but like, what are the mouthwashes? What are the skin, creams and conditioners that you should be using if you're going through radiation? What are the probiotics?
These are so important because they're not regulated by the FDA and they're over the counter. People just can get them.
And so, and we're going to do everything evidence-based and physician recommended, like approved by, a medical advisory board. And like the simplest way to think about it is there isn't a cancer aisle at Walgreens. So like the last time I had a really crappy cold in February and I went to Target and I spent $50 on Mucinex and NyQuil.
That's
and
a lot of stuff.
and throat lozenges and just went and got all the bunch of stuff for a cold. And I remember going to the drugstore as a chemo patient and not knowing. And it's like, is any of this stuff safe for me now that I'm going through chemo? Like, what stuff is going to work? What stuff isn't going to work? And so I want us to have a full complement, again, of products that, will be very frank with, like we tell people, your hair will thin with scalp cooling. You need to know that it will, but these are the reasons why we believe that you should do it. But having this full suite of products around all these other conditions that patients have to deal with, because there isn't a place to go. And so patients are back to, doctors, Google, Facebook, and Amazon.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, there's a lot out there, but it adds confusion. So whatever you are building there, I think it's, I'm sure you're building something that's going to minimize confusion and improve patients' understanding. My question to you is, for the scalp cooling device, do you need to take that through FDA testing and everything like that, or
Yeah, it's
is it
FDA cleared.
okay? And that process, how long did it take you to get that done? 3
I mean,
years,
we were
4
working
years?
on our FDA clearance for years. I mean,
Yeah.
but that once from the day we submitted the paperwork, from the day that we got our clearance, it was roughly 5 months. It wasn't that long.
Yeah, that's not bad.
But that's because
But the
we
process before takes 2 years.
yeah, and so so the FDA has this thing called pre-submissions where you put together a report and the FDA will meet with you. And so we did 2 pre-submissions where it's like, hi FDA, we're cooler heads. You know, we're building a scalp cooling system that's similar to these other products, but here's how ours is different. And then you get to ask them 3 key questions. So like one of the questions that we had was around the portability and the mobility of the system and the fact that you could do treatment outside of the infusion center. And so a piece of feedback we got from the FDA is they said, we're cool with that, but we're going to care a lot about what's known as human factors testing, which is the FDA for medical devices has a very regimented way that you test the usability of a medical device to make sure it's being used correctly and safely. And especially since our product is largely patient administered. So we actually went back and we did a second pre-sub that was all around our human factors testing approach. And human factors testing for startups, hundreds of thousands of dollars, takes several months. It's really hard and detailed to do. So we're like, we're going to go in and we're going to show the FDA the plan. And we got a lot of very constructive feedback on it. And so we took all their feedback. So once we got to the point where we were submitting, we'd done a bunch of work and the FDA had kind of told us what they wanted to see. And granted, the FDA isn't required to stick by what they said
Of
previously if
course.
information comes up, but we felt doing pre-subs was the way to go and paid off in spades.
So, you obviously you're doing this full time right now.
Oh yeah.
How big is your company right now?
Oh gosh. We are 15 people now, which is great. Julia, who I talked about, who's an amazing nurse navigator, runs our clinical education, customer advocacy. Ryan Denny, our chief commercial officer, his last company sold to Olympus for hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
Courtney Turek, who's
I
our
was going
VP,
to ask you,
just
as
like
a,
absolute like sales, like pathfinder. She's amazing. Like we just have this, our
yeah.
sales reps are amazing. We just hired this, really talented young woman who's going to be a clinical support specialist who joined yesterday. We have another great person joining in 2 weeks. So yeah, we're growing.
So two things. As you grow, I'm sure you're thinking, do you believe at some point you're going to be like an acquisition target? Like, is there every entrepreneur, every CEO, every founder I've interviewed, I've always asked, what's your exit strategy? Now, this does not mean you're obviously exiting the field, but you could grow way too much to be able to scale this up. Unless you raise hundreds of millions of dollars, what have you thought about?
Right? Like it's a choice.
Yeah,
And
which is a choice. Like, I guess, is it too early to ask about this or not? And one of the things I asked about this, you were in Forbes magazine. So once you make it to Forbes magazine, as you answer this question to me, Kate, tell me about how did the Forbes thing article come about? Because, that's, whether we like Forbes or not, this is an honor, I believe. This is an acknowledgement.
huge.
This is an acknowledgement for a circulation that is read by millions of people to your achievements as an entrepreneur, as a leader, as someone who really overcame adversity. So congrats on that. But I'm curious, how did this come about? How, the process of this, and, from the financial market perspective, I presume that people sometimes ask you, do you envision taking the company public? Do you envision selling the company? Do you envision partnering with somebody on commercialization and things like that?
Yeah, we know that, well, I can't say we know. we've already had overtures from strategics who, we start hitting some of our, pretty aggressive sales goals because, again, like scalp cooling has been a very small, very fragmented market. And so we're the tech follower that says, here's the business model that works for patients and that works for providers. Like, here's the disruptive business model and the better way to do this. So, I think that it is realistic to think that, an acquisition offer is something that we would be able to entertain in the next couple of years. And it'll be a decision with our investors, in the board about, do we want to just keep growing it and get it to the point where it goes public? And so, that's a story that's yet to be written. But, getting into Forbes, back to at Astra, getting part of the community. So Dr. Sylvia Ma, who was one of my early mentors, she's a contributing writer to Forbes and I don't even think she was pitching me. She was talking to Maggie, the woman, the reporter who just did that great story on us, about, some of her portfolio companies and, just trends that she was seeing. And, Maggie McGrath wanted to dig into our story. And so a lot of it is, building out that network and, always be closing, always be talking about what we're doing. But yeah, I mean, and fun little side note with the Forbes piece, it actually got translated into Hebrew and was published in Forbes in Israel, which is awesome.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
The title of the article, I'm going to link this. The title of the article is "Meet the Entrepreneur Helping Women in Chemo Keep Their Hair." And it's obviously not only it's catching, there's some pictures about how to actually this thing is applied and things of that nature. I mean, there's a lot here for the listeners and viewers to actually look at.
I'll also share with you a piece that ran last month on the San Diego Union Tribune, so our hometown paper, did a story on us as well. We're getting a decent amount of local press because we just raised around, but it's been great.
Yeah, and I hope more people are aware of this. I mean, I can tell you that I think we need to treat the hair loss piece like any other side effect, and this is very important. But I love that you are focusing on other elements of the educational opportunities. I love the PROs. We will talk offline about this. I have ideas on this.
I would love it again.
No, I mean, patients reported outcomes is everybody knows, Kate, they're so important. It is way more important to get to know from the patient how they feel and what the issues are than what we presume they are. But everybody is struggling in how you execute on making the process easier. And judging from what you have done with something way more complex than a survey or something like that, you will probably have the solution. And it's great.
Well, I mean, just one quick thing on that. So, Medicare is moving towards value-based care. And so, Medicare has the enhanced oncology model where they really want to encourage patient satisfaction, patient-reported outcomes. And so they're telling oncology writ large, like, hey, get your patients, increase patient satisfaction, get them through treatment with fewer complications, we'll pay you more money. And so I think that we're really at that critical inflection point around, to your point about patient advocacy, like, because it's well proven that, patients who are less depressed have better outcomes, right? Like they cost less money. So how can we cooler heads as being part of that supportive care journey? So having patients feeling like they have the resources and the knowledge to withstand treatment, we believe that we will be a key part of the patient's overall success. So basically, if we can help them look and feel normal, hopefully, we can help get them healthier more quickly.
So as a leader, as an entrepreneur, as an innovator, were you ever afraid of failure?
Yes, all the time. And so, but here's the thing, having been a cancer patient, having lost both my parents, and actually my best friend from business school died of metastatic breast cancer in 2018, right as I was starting this company, I think, it gives you perspective, and, the things in life that I truly regret are the things I chickened out of.
Wow, that's
And so
amazing.
I wanted to really swing to the fences, and, I told you the story about my friends who encouraged me to do this. They invested their money, and I was like, well, I can't, like, I have to, drag my body over hot coals on, my knuckles if I need to figure out, like, if this fails, I want to have tried every last thing to make it successful. And I think as entrepreneurs, something that we have to keep in check is our ego, and having a certain way that you want things to look. You have to be uncomfortable with things getting messy. Like, I want things to go this particular way. I want this sort of outcome. And one of the reasons why Cooler Heads is successful is I'm always thinking about, what's my fallback plan? What's my fallback plan? If I can't have it,
What is your fallback
whatever it
plan?
might be, like, always have a fallback plan. Like,
What is your fallback plan?
oh gosh, I mean, like, for what? I mean, there's all kinds of fallback plans.
I'll tell you, I interviewed on my podcast about 6 or 7 months ago, and you can check that out, Lee Shapiro. And Lee is a venture capitalist for Seven Wire Ventures. And it was such an interesting interview. And, if you have a chance, you'll listen to it. But one of the things that intrigued me, and I think it will resonate with you, because I asked him, I said, how many pitches do you get in a year with his firm?
Like thousands at Seven Wire.
Yeah. He
It's a
got
very
about
common.
like he's about like 2,300, like he gets in terms of pitches. So obviously almost like an average of, you can do the math.
Yeah.
But one of the things that really intrigued me about what he said, because I said, I said, I've never pitched anything to VC, but I'm assuming as the venture capitalist, it takes you maybe 5 to 6 minutes to make that decision really fast. So the first maybe 5 slides I'm showing you, you probably made up your mind right away. And maybe the rest of my 20-minute allotted time is just to kill time. And what he told me is that a lot of times he likes to invest in people.
Mm-hmm.
He really likes to know people and know the leaders
Yes.
of the people. And that really resonated because these investors really know the person, the brains behind the operation. And Kate, I'm obviously a big fan right away. I mean, this is where you shine because you have that story. And you told me something that is very, very important. You said, you maintain these relationships because you can come back to them later on and they may not invest with you round one, but round two, you come in and look, I took your feedback and I did this. And
Mm-hmm.
that's really exactly what he said. He said, when I know people that are able to tolerate adversity and the market fluctuation, because things are not going to be easy, I want to invest in people who are willing to tolerate the uncertainty of the market, the uncertainty of finances. These are the people that I want to actually go to bat for.
Yes.
And that's what you said and what I recall from what he was telling me is so aligned together.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that is absolutely the case. And I've had investors that came into this round and be like, you know, one person in particular, he said, I really didn't think, he's like, I'd heard of this before. I really thought, like, doctors hate it for all these reasons, sheer throughput, too expensive, blah, blah, blah. He's like, but watching you just figure out answers to all of those questions,
Amazing.
he's like, yeah, I want to invest.
Congratulations. What you
Yeah.
are doing is amazing. A lot of people who are listening to this podcast and viewing us on YouTube are going to be inspired by your accomplishments. And I think what you are doing is going to help a lot of patients, which is ultimately what the goal is.
Yeah.
And while you're doing it, you are helping people get employed, get jobs,
Yeah.
and you're contributing to innovation. So congratulations.
Thank you
Last
so much.
question to you. Is there anything I should have asked you I completely did not ask and overlooked?
Gosh. Um, I think you really covered the battlefield, and I really appreciate the fact that you dug into who I am and, like, what got me here. It's really unique to have the opportunity to share Kate, the person who became Kate, the entrepreneur. So thank you very much for that opportunity.
Thank you, Kate. And really, the person is who makes the entrepreneur, right? I mean, it's you're the soul of the operation because of your experience. Thank you so much for giving me some time on the podcast. Kate Dilligan on Healthcare Unfiltered.
Thank you.